Support for Current Conversations is provided by Outreach Video and Media Services, University of Oklahoma Outreach, and World Literature Today. Welcome to Current Conversations. I'm your host, R.C. Davis-Indiano. Did you know that there are more Chinese people learning English in China than there are people living in the U.S.? Today, we're going to discuss a little-known facet of Chinese-Western relations involving a revolution in how the Chinese can learn English. We have with us Professor Jonathan Stalling, a specialist on Chinese and American literature and language and the curator of the Chinese Literature Translation Archive at the University of Oklahoma. Join us for a fascinating discussion of the challenges that face Chinese speakers learning English and the global stakes riding on their success. Current Conversations is on location today in the Bizzell Memorial Library, and I want to welcome Jonathan Stalling to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Is it a sign of our times that we all feel a need increasingly to talk about issues that relate to China and the West, and specifically China and the U.S.? It doesn't seem like we really focused on things like this even a decade ago.
That's true. I mean, in the last decade, China has emerged as a global superpower in an unprecedented way, making the relationship between U.S. and China simply more important than it's ever been before.
So things that relate to how one country understands the other, especially since these are the two superpowers, the U.S. and China, how they understand each other's culture, how they understand each other's language, things that might have been, arcane issues for academics or scholars. Really, we all need to be talking about these things these days.
That's right. I mean, I suggest that viewers think about picking up some literature in translation or watch Chinese films in translation. There's so many wonderful books and films to watch, to make friendships, reach out and actually meet people. And thirdly, to really advocate language learning. I wish that Americans could understand, that we really have to seize this opportunity to bring Chinese into the classroom throughout America, but also to help in any way we can facilitate the deepening of English in China itself.
I think one of your points, and maybe you could talk about this a little bit, is that there really were and are some very real issues and problems and how the Chinese have learned English.
Right, so I see two problems here. I mean, one is our own history. From beginning in the 1880s, American media has portrayed Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants in a kind of derogatory light, and really lighting upon language and making fun of that language and turning it into something that is now called yellowface, which is the equivalent of blackface, which really was meant to disenfranchise Chinese Americans and kind of led to a culture of displacement and of prejudice that extends up to this present moment. So that is its own kind of problem. But you're right, there are other problems in China in the education system, and problems that really arise between the fact that Chinese and English are such different languages that lead to significant hurdles for Chinese learning English.
Faulty ways of learning English in China, right?
So the first is that English in China is something like calculus in America. You learn it in high school, you pass in kind of a college entrance exam, and then after that it's no longer useful for you unless you go into engineering. Almost every student in China spends 10 to 12 years learning English to pass an examination. Once that's done, then often the English goes into disuse. That's because this test is all focused on grammar and vocabulary and not on speaking. But language is a behavior. It's something you do between people. And if you don't have practice using it orally, then sometimes it can disappear. The other problem has to do with, again, the Chinese language itself, and the differences between Chinese characters and letters lead to a lot of problems.
Now, I think one of your points, if I understand you correctly, is while it's a comic thing that the Chinese speak English badly, I think you think there are actually some errors in the way that they taught pronunciation.
Right. So that's back to the problem of the incompatibility of the two languages on a sonic level or an acoustic or, in terms of phonics, right? The two languages don't match very easily because Chinese use characters which are single syllables. It's like trying to pronounce apple by saying the spelling, A-P-P-L-E. Let me give you an example. So if you take the English word please and you write it out in Chinese characters, you try to spell the word please, it would be 铺里斯. If the composer Strauss, if you wanted to write his name out in Chinese characters, it becomes 四子老师. One syllable becomes 4 syllables.
Which really could be unintelligible to a native English speaker.
I'm afraid that's right. So the bridge, the phonetic bridge between English and Chinese is essentially broken, or it was never discovered in the first place.
Okay, so and that's what we're going to be talking about today, because that's what your research is about. And we're in this exhibit called the Poetics of Invention. So let's go next to the area where we can maybe point to some of the things that you've discovered.
I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. And what I'd like to do is ask you to explain what you came up with in your research.
Right. Well, the subtitle of this exhibit is called Bridging Modern Languages with Ancient Technologies. And it's counterintuitive, but actually the technology, the linguistic technology built 1,000 years ago in China to solve the problems of that time period can be used to solve the problems of today. And so this tradition is called the rhyme table tradition.
What do you mean by, is this rhyme in the sense of the way words rhyme in poetry, or is it a more specific sense?
Yeah, it is more specific. It's even spelled differently, R-I-M-E.
Okay.
And it refers to the vowel in the Chinese syllable. And these are maps of the Chinese sound system. But to understand this, we have to think about the problem. So imagine 1,000 years ago in China, China is this huge empire. And just like today, people speak in different accents and different dialects, so different, more different than Spanish is from Portuguese. So these maps of sound actually created a single norm, a single standard, where everyone in the entire empire could agree upon a set of pronunciations. Those are tables. They're in fact right here. So if you look at the table, you'll see that on the horizontal axis, you'll notice that there are consonants on the top, right? And again, language has both consonants and vowels, right? And so the consonants are on the horizontal axis, and in the vertical column, you have the vowels. And at every meeting point, what the Chinese discovered is they could use Chinese characters to suggest either the consonant or the vowel, and then used characters to spell out words. That's not how characters are used today. Today, each character is a whole syllable. But in these rhyme tables, they're used like an alphabet.
So this was a very important system of representation that allowed the Chinese to talk about different dialects of Chinese and relate them all to sort of a common main Chinese.
That's right. So it started in the Tang Dynasty in 600 AD, evolved over about a 400-year period, and then in the Song Dynasty really came to be known as the rhyme tables. And no matter where you were in the empire, you'd be able to agree upon what is the actual pronunciation of this character.
Rhyme tables are very powerful representations and descriptions of language.
Yeah, so right here, we are in this room which is representing the technology of that time period. All these inventions helped the Chinese empire become more efficient in all of its work. But I like to think of invention not necessarily in terms of these tables or these tables back here, which are physical objects, but it's actually the idea of the rhyme table. That's the real invention. That's the innovation that was used for 1,000 years in what was called the Chinese imperial examination system.
So if the Chinese had a very powerful way of representing sounds with characters, why it would make sense that when they maybe tried to learn something really foreign to them later, like English, they would use that powerful system of descriptions of sounds. Is that what happened? No.
So, the reason is that the Chinese empire has no reason to pronounce another language correctly. China, sometimes is translated as the Middle Kingdom, but a better translation is the Central State. It's at the middle, of the world in its own worldview. It doesn't need to learn the pronunciation of another language. Not until English, over the last 20 years, would that be a situation that would have faced a Chinese person.
So what was your discovery? What was your insight when you saw the descriptive power of what they had created in these tables?
Do you remember when you asked me the question about the problems that Chinese learners of English encounter when they're trying to pronounce English and why it's so difficult when one word like please becomes 不理思? This technology means that you're not using characters as syllables, you're using them as letter sounds. And so you can spell out the word please, and it's just as easy and just as transparent to use as letters. See, when I learn Chinese, I use Western letters. So if I want to learn the word ren, it's like R-E-N. But you can't do that in reverse. But now you can using this technology.
So, in other words, this system that describes sounds from, the 10th to the 13th century had the power to get worked through and get around the kind of mispronunciation that we were talking about with comic characters in films, where the Chinese can't say things that are really intelligible to an English speaker.
Yeah, but of course that isn't the history that happened. Of course,
it was a potential.
It was a potential that was always there, but an unrealized one.
Okay, so what did you do to, make this useful to us now?
So this technology, of course, in this format isn't very useful. This is a textbook from 1,000 years ago, but using algorithms, we're able to update this technology and really fuse English and Chinese at the level of their phonetic DNA, resequence the English genome into Chinese characters. And I'll show you that in a little bit.
Okay. Now, there are lots of cultural implications to Chinese that we really need to understand as well, too. Could we talk a little bit about that, maybe yin, yang, some of those?
Sure. So this is partly what the exhibit is for, in fact, to talk about how the language system, this rhyme table system, really speaks to the kind of core Chinese imperial knowledge system. And if you look over on this side of the room, for instance, we see the hands, the human hands, used as a way to map out the not just the language system, but also the Chinese traditional worldview. The traditional Chinese worldview is really interrelated. So when you learn one thing, you're also learning how other things operate. And this is sometimes referred to as a cosmology or as a worldview. I like to call it the imperial knowledge system. And that includes such concepts as yin and yang and the 5 elements. And over here we see the human hand, which of course naturally has 5. The two different pages that are here, one of them is representing the 5 notes of the pentatonic scale. And the Chinese would have thought of that as something that was almost divine by heaven. This is what produces harmony and beauty in the world. Humans can't mess with it. It's a natural fact. The human hand also has 5, and there are 5 elements: wood, fire, metal, earth, and water. On the other side, you have the 5 places of articulation: the teeth, the lips, the tongue sounds. And so these are the 5 places that you would create consonants. And all of the different information at that time, whether it's civil planning, like planning a city, or if it was architecture, medicine, biology, early chemistry, astronomy, would all use this system to organize information. So essentially, when we're learning about how the English and Chinese language can fold together, we're at the same time learning about the traditional Chinese worldview.
So there's a kind of coherence in Chinese culture that might be a little startling for the West, where the sound system that you're getting into, once you understand it and see the implications, it leads you out to a larger worldview and ultimately cultural values and a lot of things. Everything is cross-indexed to everything else.
What's nice about this, though, is that the empire can test whether a subject of the empire knows this system. You can't really give a cooking test or a biology test or an astronomy test so well, but you can give a poetry exam. That poetry exam would test your ability to harmonize the elements, the 5 elements, through parallelism, or by making yin and yang balance together. And so a poetry exam could actually grant you access into the government.
So in the US or in the West, we would never give poetry that kind of centrality. But what you're saying is that for the ancient Chinese, poetry really was sort of the nexus of the world. It connected really everything.
Yeah, and of course that's why the rhyme table tradition exists, because if you wanted to take this exam and get entry into the bureaucracy, no matter where you came from in the empire, you may have a different dialect, you can study those documents and rhyme in the same way as everyone else, right? And that would be the way of...
So in a way that would be absolutely counterintuitive to a Westerner, a test that would show your proficiency, your understanding of poetry, would really be a test of your adequacy as a citizen, as a person, as somebody that could be a person of power in Chinese culture.
That's right. Responsibility and beauty in the same document, the same test. And this might seem fairly abstract or a little bit exotic, but actually we've been teaching Oklahoma students from kindergarten through adult how to write and compose this kind of test poetry in English.
Jonathan, I'd like to go in the next room that's focused on poetry, because I'd like to stay on this topic a little longer.
So for over 20 years, I've been teaching how to compose classical Chinese poetry in English. And as a teacher of Chinese poetry, it's difficult to explain these abstract concepts to students. But when you can give them the tools to build their own poetry, then they master that material through hands-on experience.
Especially when poetry just really doesn't have that kind of importance in modern American culture.
That's right, but after a day or two of writing the jueju form, this particular form of poetry...
Could you say the name again?
Yeah, it's called jueju, and it means a quatrain, 4 lines. When you learn to compose this highly regulated, sophisticated kind of, it's almost like English Sudoku, right? So almost don't think about it as poetry, almost think about it as a complex word game. When the students learn the rules, then they start identifying, oh, that person really understands the system, right? They actually become aware of what makes beauty beautiful in the Chinese context because they're good at it.
Would it be accurate to say that this, say the name of the poetry again?
Jueju.
That it's a kind of word grid, and there are slots for certain kinds of words. So when the students follow the rules, they're putting words in the slots that belong there?
That's right. So those rules are the rules we were talking about in the rhyme table tradition, like what rhymes with what, and so on. The regulation of yin and yang and the 5 elements, all those things are embedded in the rules. So when the students learn the rules and then follow them, they actually learn this system. And so there's over 1,000 entries from all over Oklahoma, from Lawton or Elgin down to Podu and so on.
Entries in an annual competition.
Annual competition called the Newman Prize for English Jueju. It's a part of the Newman Prize for Chinese Literature held here at the University of Oklahoma.
So while students end up writing a poem in English, they're following rules that connect the parts of that poem to the world's values, a kind of worldview, exactly as all of that functioned in a very tightly cross-indexed way in Chinese. It's happening in English.
It's happening in English, but what's interesting to note is it also happened in Vietnamese, it happened in Korean, it happened in Japanese. In fact, the history of Chinese literature moving outside of China is not a history of translation, it's a history of languages learning to do this, languages learning to follow these rules. And you have to change the language a little bit. These poems have to be monosyllabic, but otherwise, you can teach people how to think, and in a particularly deep classical Chinese worldview fashion.
Think in a Chinese way, even though they're writing
in Japanese or
or English or whatever.
Or English. That's right.
Okay. It seems to me that what you're talking about raises the question of what if there was greater influence of this ancient way of thinking into the present. Would that be the next exhibit? Can we talk about that?
Absolutely. So, what we're really talking about is this 1,000-year idea, 1,000-year-old idea that could have existed for 1,000 years to help people write better Jueju poetry, for instance. But what happens when we actually get to that point of first contact, when the English first came to China? What if we could rewrite that point in history? If we could use this technology, and English and Chinese could have been fused at the level of their DNA from go.
Okay, so what do we have here?
Right, so we began in the Song Dynasty, right? And so when we entered that part of the exhibit, we were in that intellectual environment of that time. All the technology was, built around that time period. Here, we've come to that moment of first contact between Chinese and English. In 1882, the first book of English was sequenced into Chinese characters, but it wasn't this scholarly tradition that did it. Instead, it were businessmen who were simply trying to haggle prices, things like that on the street. And so if I wanted to know how much something was, I could say, how much, or something like this, and you would kind of get it. And then you would say, 9, and so on. And it didn't need a really precise system to do business and trade. That's the real history of English and Chinese, and that's what's led to the particular hurdles that Chinese speakers have learning.
Hence another indication of the teaching of English going the wrong way in China.
Yeah.
They had a more precise descriptive system. That's not what prevailed. Commerce drove the teaching of English, and we have the sort of comic bad pronunciation that we have today in films coming out of that.
Yeah, and again, my take on the comic, is a kind of way of hearing that sound. And, in my background, work in poetry and poetics and literature is really to hope to let Americans hear even that sound in a completely new and good way. Because I actually think the Chinese English system has its own values, even when it is so-called mispronounced. However, if it could have gone the other way, if the scholars had used this tradition that we've been looking at to help first contact succeed, then we would have been, I think, in a very different place where English could be learned more quickly, more effectively. Mm-hmm. People would spend less money on it and have more more payoff for their labor. So as we enter this room, this is the what if room. Like, what if that technology actually was used? And so what we're surrounded by here is the high technology of the Victorian period and how it would have been used to teach that system, that rhyme table system, to Chinese English learners of that time.
So what's this, for example?
So a zoetrope would be high tech in that Victorian period. These are actually animations. So the still shows the vowel sounds of the English language. This is the vowel E, and it would show, here's a Chinese character for E, here's the English vowel for E, right? And high tech, whether it's this or whether it's the woodblock printing press or whether it's an app, there's always a way to help bring a new idea into being by showing people a convergence of technology and novelty.
In your research that showed this path that could have happened and needs to happen now but didn't happen before, what surprised you the most? This is a big discovery that you made.
Yeah, so when I started the rhyme table project, I didn't know that it would work. It was, of course, just a guess. And so the first sequences I would test with subjects, and they would pronounce words using that system, and it started to work. I built about 500 words. I took those words to the Office of Technology Development at OU and said, I think I built a stable phonetic map between these two languages. And they helped me produce an algorithm by funding collaborations. And that algorithm one day took that 500-word rhyme table over there and turned it into 130,000 English words. So we saw the complete resequencing of English into Chinese characters. And that, every time I see it, in fact, is surprising because its accuracy, its elegance, its efficiency is just, it's nearly shocking every time I witness it.
So what we're going to see in the next room is the kind of practical application that sequencing made possible. And then at the far end, apps that are marketable products that can be out there in the world that are the application of what you discovered and then this resequencing that you're talking about.
That's right. So I get to explore this theoretically and philosophically and aesthetically as I do as an artist or as a poet, but also really work at helping solve real people's problems. And hundreds of millions of people who do have this problem learning English pronunciation can be helped if we are able to successfully scale these innovations.
Can you next show us the room of apps?
Of course.
Okay, we've been talking about marketing intellectual products, and so now we bring into the picture the Rani K. Irani Center for the Creation of Economic Wealth. And isn't this a prototype of a booth that you might see at a conference where intellectual property products that have come out of your work would be marketed?
Yeah, so the ICCEW is the internship program run by Price College, where I get to work as an inventor with students from computer engineering or engineering, philosophy, art, design, and so on. I've had over 23 students who have worked on this project over the years. And these students bring their own skills to the table. So writing code, writing design, building the websites, but also doing product market research, going out, asking questions, doing interviews, trying to find out what would be the way to create the best, what's called a minimal viable product, right? So what is the cheapest, best version of your idea that you can put on the market, actually test it with consumers and see whether or not they like the idea. Of course, as a professor, I wouldn't be able to do that myself. It would be quite expensive. So this program helps me actually run a hypothesis like this concept.
So just to be clear, in this instance, we're talking about apps that have been produced out of the research that we've been talking about up to this point that are potentially sold on the market.
That's right. So in fact, the ICCEW students did launch the app on the App Store, and it's been downloaded thousands of times in China. And in those interactions, I learn from the users what they like and don't like about the product.
Is that what you can show us here?
That's right. So
how does this work?
So the app itself has the characters that we saw over there on the rhyme tables. They're broken up into the consonant and the vowel. And so you can learn how to make the vowel sounds of English using this app. And you can learn how to make the consonant sounds. Now, that keyboard, that's the entire English language. That's all you need. The two languages have the same vowels, or nearly the same vowels, and nearly the same consonants, but they're missing four, these four. And so this one here, this character says, vibrate your larynx, and bite your tongue. Try it with me. So that's the like the sound.
Yeah.
So they're missing that sound, but a Chinese character can actually tell you how to make that sound. And that's one reason why Chinese characters work better than letters to teach English sounds in China. The app also includes that algorithm that I was describing, 130,000 English words. You just go to the word, and it gives you a whole map. What sounds should you pronounce and not pronounce are all mapped out here. Every English word, right? So all you would need to learn this system is in here, including interactive games.
This is very exciting because it's one thing to talk about missed opportunities and what your invention made possible, but here is an actual application that allows somebody to get the benefit of those insights and learn English sounds a lot faster by pushing the right button.
Absolutely. That's the beauty of the mobile applications, right? It's free to download, and we get to find out if people like this idea, and if they don't, what's the next step along the journey of the idea into the world.
What's your best hope? What's your dream of the impact that this can have over the next few years? What would you like to see happen?
For me, the goal here is to, of course, help English become a language that people speak in China, not just learn in China to pass exams to get into college, but imagine 350 English learners actually using English in their lives. As you started this show, mentioning there's
350 million.
Million. Yeah. Sorry, million. There's no more important relationship than the U.S.-China relationship, perhaps, in terms of geopolitics. We need this language bridge. At this moment in time, it's incredibly vulnerable. 10, 20, 30 years in the future, we may not be seeing English being taught at that scale. So I'm hoping that this bridge will help people cross over and build personal face-to-face relationships that will improve not only their lives, but I believe the world. And that's a pretty big hope.
That's a pretty important place to stop. Thank you, Jonathan Stalling.
Thank you.
I'm so glad that you could be with us today. Join us next time for more current conversations. Thank you so much for joining us.